Hello and welcome back to Hypatia's Lantern. I hope you're all doing well, especially everyone in the United Kingdom who are back in lockdown and those of you in the United States. Today we're going to discuss democracy, which, given Wednesday night's attempted coup and the chaos there, seems more relevant than ever before. Originally, I was going to talk about free speech, but I thought, seeing as we talked about fascism and a lot of other isms, it's worth talking about the central governing principle for Europe, the United States, and what so many movements around the world are fighting for. Democracy is pretty simple to define. The original root of demos meaning the people and kratia meaning power or rule, so literally demos kratia, rule of the people. I've always loved finding the roots of words and this was no exception. Now we have a pretty literal definition there, but there are so many thousands of iterations that cover such a broad spectrum of systems. When talking of democracy, our first conception is always ancient Athens, the lectures of Socrates and the school of Plato, the symposium of Pericles and the empowerment of the assembly, and yet Athenian democracy was not only incredibly limited, but also incredibly restrictive. Athenian democracy was limited to men and citizens. The second one seems obvious, that only citizens are allowed to vote. The point of limitation, or contention as we would see it, is who is classed as an Athenian citizen. In the modern conception of citizenship, you have two main doctrines, jus sanguinis and jus soli. Don't worry, I will define those terms. Jus sanguinis is by right of blood, so if you are born to a citizen, you are therefore a citizen. Jus soli is by right of soil, or land as we would say. If you are born within the state's territorial entity, you are therefore a citizen. Most countries operate a blended system of the two. The common standard is that you are eligible for citizenship up until your grandparents. So, if your grandparents are Irish and you were born in the United States, you are eligible for Irish citizenship, but your children will not be. Jus soli is a little more varied. Most countries restrict jus soli because it is very easy for people to acquire citizenship. Most European countries say that if a person is born on that country's soil and remain there for a period of years, sometimes 6, sometimes 10, they are therefore eligible for citizenship. Other countries, such as the United States, practiced almost unrestricted jus soli citizenship, per the 14th Amendment from 1868, which states that anyone born in the United States or within US jurisdiction is therefore a US citizen. That last bit is important, but we'll come back to it later. Our little detour aside, how does this affect Athenian citizenship? Well, Athenian citizenship was incredibly harsh on jus sanguinis. It was solely inherited. You could not receive citizenship through residence. In this way, many of the metics or foreigners who lived in Athens for generations, paid taxes for generations, and contributed to the defence of the city for generations were still denied citizenship. It was estimated that during the time of Pericles, only a third of Athenians actually had citizenship, and of course, slaves couldn't ever be a citizen. So you had, in effect, a third of the populace making the decisions for the remaining 2/3, who were not permitted a say at all. Today, we would not class this as a democracy, we'd call it something closer to an oligarchy, even though by the standards of the time, Athens was a democracy amongst oligarchies, and even then, democracy wasn't a guarantee of freedom. A good example of this is Spartan women, who are far freer than Athenian women. It's not a simple divide. It is always fascinating to see how standards change. Athenian democracy was very fickle. There were no protections against the will of the assembly, no prevention on its exercise of power or restriction. Athens was a direct democracy, not representative. That is, that all eligible citizens, males of 20 or older, were, whenever they chose, given direct access to decision-making power through the courts or the assembly. A good illustrative story is that of Thucydides, who's been mentioned previously on this channel. Overly Sarcastic Productions did a good short biography of him, and I would definitely recommend that video. Thucydides was an Athenian citizen and general who failed at defending Amphipolis because the Spartan general Brasidas, yes, that one from Assassin's Creed, realised he was coming and got the city to surrender before his arrival. Thucydides, by what we can tell, acted as any commander would have and set off at due course. He can't really be held at fault for the loss of Amphipolis, yet He was recalled and then put on trial by the assembly when his political enemies used the anger and fear at the loss of Amphipolis to whip up sentiment against him and then exiled him for 20 years. There was no protection, no right to consider due process, just straight exile. We would call this the tyranny of the majority. Next, on the traditional story of democracy, we come to ancient Rome, specifically the period between the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, so the Roman Republic, running from 509 BC to 27 AD. The Roman Republic had a more expanded vision of citizenship, established over centuries of internal strife with more restrictive access to power. It was a curious mix of a representative democracy and oligarchy. After overthrowing the monarch, the ultimate power in Rome fell instead to the Senate, the patrician class who represented the highest echelons of Roman society. They weren't always the wealthiest, but generally were, due to their position. The men of each patrician family were expected to embark on the cursus honorum, the course of honour. The idea was that each family is in competition with each other to bring the most glory to Rome, and therefore their family. Each successful election brings dignitas and auctoritas to that family that is then passed down. There were a series of offices that a patrician could be elected to, which culminated in the consulship. The consuls were two elected officials who were in effect kings for a year. They were of course limited, but this was the pinnacle of Roman political society. After becoming consul, you were barred from becoming consul again for a period of 10 years. When Rome began to expand, outgoing consuls were given governorship of provinces for usually a period of a year, but this could and often was changed. Some provinces, usually the more tranquil inner provinces, were given to praetors who were further down on the ladder, and were not permitted to command legions. Proconsuls, who were given governorship of provinces, did have imperium, and so could raise and command legions. They were in effect given temporary royal authority over a province, and immunity from prosecution so long as they held that office. That last bit is a big part of the issue that caused Caesar to march on Rome, but that's better suited towards a different video at a different time. For us, the important thing here is that following a series of ruptures, where a republic set up as a city-state acquired an empire, the political system of Rome began to crack. As the wealth of that empire flowed into the hands of the patrician class, the plebeians began to feel more and more economic pressure. The patchwork of family farms quickly started to run out of business as latifundia, or larger farm estates owned by patricians and ran primarily on slave labour, undercut them and then bought them out. This created a massive urbanization pressure which pushed people towards Rome, and the senatorial class, who had little care or knowledge of these problems, simply ignored them. Over time, this problem grew and grew until eventually it erupted into violence, which established the office of a tribune of the plebs, barred to any patrician, and which held the right to veto any legislation, to summon the Senate, and intervene on behalf of the plebs on any legal matter. Their person was sacrosanct, and attack on them was met by the death penalty. This was seen as a backstop to prevent the abuse of the plebs, but only contributed to the rising political chaos and gridlock. In some ways, this was representative democracy, in that the Senate acted as the will of the people of Rome. They were, as they described themselves, the best men, and therefore capable of making the decisions needed to guide Rome to prosperity and success, with a counterbalance in the form of a tribune of the plebs. Voting was permitted by all recorded Roman citizens who were catalogued during the census every decade. People were sorted into different tribes or classes. This was a corrupt process, and the censor had absolute power over the roles of citizenship, and it led to some rather blatant gerrymandering. The Roman method also had a client system, where an individual with political and economic power would distribute some of that power down to his clients in exchange for their support and vote. The more clients, the more powerful someone was in Rome. Lastly, by the end of a republic, though every citizen was eligible to become consul, it was the plaything of a senatorial class due to the vast sums of money required. Many Romans went into an incredible amount of debt in order to secure the consulship, and the practice grew to such eye-watering sums that Julius Caesar spent practically all of the money he received from conquering Gaul on paying down the debts he accrued. Such was the corruption of that election in 59 BC that even Cato, renowned to this day for his incorruptibility, started bribing people to vote against Caesar. When the Republic ended, so too did democracy. The appearance of it remained, with the emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, at least early on, paying lip service to the traditions. They simply operated in the shadows with a tacit understanding that violence would follow disobedience. But by the end of that dynasty and on from there, even that fig leaf disappeared in its entirety. Roman citizenship, however, expanded and was seen as one of the most precious things a person could gain, though it was unequal until the Edict of Caracalla. That is why one of the proudest boasts in the classical world was civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. During the early medieval period, democracy sprang up everywhere in the former Western Roman Empire and beyond. Cities self-governed, tribes had elder councils, some cities set themselves up as republics modelled on Rome, and so on. They were all very localised sorts of democracies, as the fracture of the empire was piecemeal by small Germanic tribes. These tribes were led by very insecure leaders who depended on the consent of the governed to govern at all. As these states coalesced into the high medieval period, a fair few of these institutions were abolished as more powerful leaders in larger territorial entities were able to stamp down on these rights. Sometimes, however, events did go the other way, as with Simon de Montfort's rebellion in England and with the creation of the Magna Carta and through it, Parliament. By the late medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, it would be fair to say that most of these democracies were gone. But within Italy specifically, city-states began to free themselves and self-govern as republics, the most famous of these being the Republic of Firenze, or Florence in English, Pisa, Milan, Perugia, Siena, and of course, La Serenissima Repubblica di Venezia. Yes, I absolutely love saying the full name. In England specifically, following the end of the Civil War, Parliament grabbed powers in the absence of a king and retained them until the restoration of Charles II's rule. With the Glorious Revolution 28 years later and the removal of James in favour of Mary, Parliament again grabbed more power, which prevented the rule of an absolute monarch, which in Europe was becoming the norm. That famous refrain from Louis XIV of "L'État c'est moi" dates from this period. It literally means I am the state, and is referring to more than his personal royal power. He's referring to the fact that in the face of all of his citizens and subjects, his desires mean more. The state of France does not exist without Louis, and the state of France functions for his personal goals and motivations only. This is obviously at odds with democracy, which holds that every stakeholder, that is every citizen, has rights and duties within a state. From there we move on to two defining moments, the US War of Independence and the French Revolution. In the United States and in a lot of the popular cultural media, there is this mythology around the US War of Independence as a resounding shot for freedom, and in some ways those iconic words that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are incredibly important, but they weren't new then, and in some ways, those words were both deeply ironic and tragic. When they wrote all men, they didn't mean you and I, they didn't mean people of colour, they didn't mean the working classes, they meant men like themselves, erudite, educated, wealthy, white landowning men, not women, not anyone who didn't meet that narrow standard. The founding fathers of the United States weren't fighting for freedom for all people. They were fighting for freedom from taxes for their class. Only one of the signatories on that document didn't own slaves. Only one. And the nation they founded has for the majority of its existence prevented people of colour from being free, going so far as to fight a war amongst themselves on this very issue, and then, on creating and entrenching a system that for nearly a century further prevented that very same minority from having any semblance of equal rights. It is still within living memory that the first children went to desegregated schools, facing hordes of raging white people, angry that such a child would or could ever share the same centres of learning. If we were to transform the United States 245 years into a clock face, it is only in the last 18 minutes that you could even begin to make the argument that all men are created equal. And even then, with what we have seen in the past year alone, between the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Rayshard Brooks, the murder of Daniel Prude, or even the unjustified, indiscriminate violence by police forces in response to protests, that those solemn words, written in such flowery language, is a promise unkept. With the French Revolution, anger, searing anger over so long a system of oppression where entire classes were kept poor, hungry, and without chance of advancement, whilst an entrenched nobility sat amongst towers of gold and mountains of food, erupted. A war fought on land and sea, at home and abroad, was the consequence. Entire families killed in the bloodletting as revenge was taken for oppression. In some ways, this fiery outburst was far more progressive than the preceding US War of Independence. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens did not explicitly ban slavery due to the influence of the wealthier mercantile classes prominent in the Revolution, but did lead to it, as the unqualified Article 1 was used by abolitionists to formally abolish slavery. However, Napoleon re-established it, only for it to be finally abolished again in 1817 and the legal structures in 1848. The rights of women were explicitly left out, prompting Olympe de Gouges to write, "This revolution will only take effect when all women become fully aware of their deplorable condition and of the rights they have lost in society." The Napoleonic Code explicitly relegated women to second-class citizenship devoid of agency, and it is only in 1944, in the aftermath of liberation, that women won the right to vote. The fight for equal rights for women in France, as everywhere in the world, continues. Despite two different moments declaring freedom and democracy, we see clearly that the status of minorities was not assured, the rights of women neglected and even suppressed, the rights of people of colour theoretical and in some places often never properly enforced. In our modern understanding of democracy, we usually use the word liberal democracy to fix our understanding firmly on the idea that rights should be expanded, not contracted, that our vision of democracy should not be as Athenian democracy in tyranny of the majority, but should be consultative, that the rights and opinions of the populace that lost the election should be paid attention to, that the governing party or candidate, despite the triumphant mandate, should govern for all the people, that it should be a government of the nation, for the nation, and by the nation. Yet we live in a world where the most powerful democratic country and the global hegemon has half the nation believing that their president was robbed of an election by claims of voter fraud that are so ridiculous they beg a belief. A fraudulent referendum was used as a basis to drag Britain out of the European Union and deprive 65 million people of rights that at least half consider essential. The acrimonious divisions between groups in society are starting to spin out of control as people tired of being told "not now" are demanding the legal rights that our constitutions, written and otherwise, promise. Trans people are demanding the dignity and legal protections denied to them that they deserve as fellow human beings, and all around us we see democracy no longer as a tool for liberation but oppression. We're going to wrap up here for this week in part 1. I understand that some people found the longer form approach a bit challenging to listen to, so what I'll do instead is split these videos up into shorter segments that will be easier to listen to. It's a bit more work as it's more challenging to find an actual stop-off point halfway through, but it does allow me to develop more ideas across the weeks and potentially respond to points in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's installment, and hopefully I'll see you back next week for part 2. Thank you and goodbye.